This is a weekly roundup for Thesis Seminar. Thesis Seminar is an open course for pre-service English language teachers. These are teachers who are working towards BA in English language teaching. And this week we go under assignments. We're working on our data collection. In fact, we're finishing our data collection process. And I'd like to make a few comments, some things to remember for those who are taking the course, and things to consider to conclude this week going into next week, week 12. So here we're at the data collection process here. We're at this point where we need to be finishing collecting all of our data. And so there's some things that I'd like for us to remember and consider here. A couple of weeks ago you were asked to complete your method section. Your method section should be approximately 500 words, and it should include 3 sections: your participants, instruments, and procedure. And when you completed it, you were basically projecting what you had planned to do during the data collection process. Now that you are concluding it, I'd like for you to revisit your work in Google Drive, go back and look and see if there's anything there that needs to be changed. Probably, for example, the procedure section, you may need to make some modifications. If you had planned on collecting data in a certain way, perhaps that changed, and that's fine, as long as you go back and update it. So I'd like to remind everyone to go back and look at each of the 3 sections in your method section, your participants, instruments, and procedure, and make sure that everything is up to date. I would recommend doing that now while it's still fresh, and you can go ahead and finish cleaning this up. That way you can focus on your analysis and later your findings, writing out the rest of your thesis. Remember also, you're asked to include in the appendix at the end of your document the actual instrument. So again, if there are any changes to the instruments that you made, that's fine as long as you remember to go back to the document in Google Drive and make those changes. And again, I would recommend doing that sooner than later. Now, one thing I would suggest that you add or consider also in the procedure section, we haven't talked much about this. Remember, in the procedure section, you're going to be including information about how you applied your instruments, how you collected the data. Remember that the purpose of the method section is for the reader to understand how you collected the data. If they want to duplicate the study, what would they need to know in order for them to apply a similar study or modify it in a certain way, but that they understand how you collected the data. So make sure that's fairly concise, but specific enough to make it clear to the reader. One thing that I would add to the procedure, and I'm taking this from Patton's Qualitative Research and Evaluation Methods book, and I think it's something to remember, and I would include this in the procedure section. These are different dimensions or areas that you might want to explain in the procedure section with regard to your observations and how you observed if you were applied your research. So I'm going to go through very quickly these 6 different aspects, and some of these aspects may apply more to some of you than others, but try to include those excuse me, that are most relevant to your study. So the first point here is the role of the observer. So for you as the observer, the researcher, did you play a participative role? Were you intervening in the process of collecting the data, or were you more of an outsider observing? So you want to explain that and make that clear in the procedure section. The second point here is whether or not you were an insider or not. So if you were observing someone, for example, were you observing from your own school? Are you a teacher at that school? So that you would be considered more of an insider because you perhaps are working at that school and you're also doing research in that school. If you're observing a school that where you don't work, you would be considered more of an outsider. The third point here, you want to write out that you were the primary researcher. So you could, in some cases, the teachers, the participants of the study are actually part of the research. But in this case, you want to just indicate that you were the sole researcher and that you were responsible for obtaining the information. The fourth point to consider here is to realize and articulate in your procedure section how much information was disclosed and how much information was not disclosed. What I mean by that is when you observed, did the teachers know what you were observing? And did you, for example, discuss this with them beforehand or not? Did you discuss this with them more in detail later on throughout the data collection process? And if so, how? Again, in this section, very briefly, describe that how you actually disclosed information, if at all, and if the teachers were aware as they were being observed what you were observing. The fifth point to remember is whether or not you had one observation or if you had several observations, basically how many observations you had, and you want to make that clear in your procedure section if you just had a single observation or if you had several. In most cases, most of you had several, but you want to make that clear in your procedure section. And the last thing is to explain if you were focusing on a very specific language item, for example, if they were talking and you were analyzing chunks of language, or if you were analyzing more holistically, more broadly, and you want to kind of describe very briefly in your research in terms of if you were focusing on a very specific item, language item, for example, or looking more broadly. So these are 6 items. You may not have to talk a lot about each one of these. Just very briefly, try to cover some of these aspects to give the reader an idea about how what your role was and your approach and how you obtained the information. So I would consider some of this information in your procedure section. We can talk about this next week. I'd like to meet with everyone next week before a break to make sure that we have a chance to talk about how we want to analyze the information, how we want to code the data. I would ask that you bring in a sample transcription that we can look at so that we can look concretely at the information, the data that you have, and I can give some examples of how you can code information into your work. So I hope this helps. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me in Canvas or come by my office and we can schedule time to meet face-to-face.